Yes, family. Let's see if we can get through some of this information here now. And I really wanted to touch on Rise Up the Chat Room, family. I don't reach your own tonight. I'll come into you now. No time I run. Rise up the wall on them. Yeah, rise up all the listeners. Yes. Near and far. Yeah, I want to touch on some of this information, some research out of the Criminal Justice Matters. It's a quarterly, and it's produced by the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. And it's an interesting quarterly. As I said, about 2 weeks ago, I played a little bit of information. If I can, if I do have time, I'll try and play a little bit more. But I most definitely want to read some of the articles, some of the papers that were presented for this particular quarterly, because I thought they were quite interested in light of what's going on around the world, really, at the moment. So, do try to bear with me. I mean, basically, you know, I want to know, and I'm sure a lot of other people would like to know, you know, what will it take for, you know, certain types of actions that will be beneficial, you know, for a lot of people. What will it take for, you know, us to engage in activity that will bring that about? That will stop us griping and moaning about the things that are happening to us that are systematic, I might add. They're not just random. They might appear random, but they're systematic because, you know, it happens in the, you know, structure and the framework of somebody's idea of how we should live. So we need to appreciate that it's systematic. What are we going to do to change the things that we don't like? Not just what we're going to do, what we're going to do to change things, really, to change the things we don't like, you know, things that we can speak about often. So I want to really read a few of these, or at least pieces out of these articles, and most definitely I'd like to read this one to begin with. Yeah, so let me drop this down a little bit. So this particular article I'm going to begin with is titled Policing the Riots from Bristol and Brixton to Tottenham via Toxteth, Handsworth, etc. It's by Tony Jefferson, this particular presentation. As I said, it's a serious quarterly, yeah, because all the practitioners in the field of criminology, applied social sciences, and other various fields take part, and they do actually present their papers for serious consideration on policy making. These are some of the people who the government come to for answers as experts in the field in terms of how they're going to structure social life in this particular country. So I think it's quite interesting to hear what some of them have got to say, you know. So yeah, we'll begin with that particular one. Again, it's called Policing the Riots from Bristol and Brixton to Tottenham via Toxteth, Handsworth, etc. And he begins, the most surprising thing about this summer's riots was the surprise that greeted them, as if we had not seen their like before. If not actually hypocritical, such surprise is disingenuous. Once poor people have exhausted what few legitimate resources they have, if feelings of anger and frustration have not been mollified by those in authority, under certain conditions, a riot, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, as an outbreak of active lawlessness or disorder among the populace, can ensue. Since such outbreaks historically have been largely confined to the poor and dispossessed, it would seem to be definitional of such outbreaks that they are also expressive acts, impotent howls of rage by those with little and little to lose, which for a while empower the powerless by subverting the dominant order, if only by wanton acts of destruction and looting. This seems to describe the beginnings of this summer's riots. The spark that ignited the original disturbance in Tottenham, the death of a black person at the hands of the police in a poor, deprived neighbourhood with long-standing antagonistic relations between police and young people, uncannily echoes the starting point of many of the major urban disturbances of the past 30 years. After the first Brixton riots of 81, the subsequent report by Lord Scarman in 1981 concluded that these were essentially an outburst of anger and resentment by young people, young black people, against the police. That anger had a history. During the 1970s, poor young black youths in deprived inner city locations began to be seen as troublesome and potentially criminal. Concern about street robberies in the early part of the decade came to be seen in a new light, and a moral panic about muggings was born. Increasingly seen as a black crime, aggressive policing using ancient stop and search powers and the old sus laws, which allowed police to arrest and secure convictions purely on suspicion of an impending illegality, were used disproportionately against young black males, often involving the police flooding of an area. This concern about black crime was used also to justify a heavy, intimidating police presence at the revived Notting Hill Carnival. The reappearance of the National Front, the NF, during this period, marching and meeting in immigrant areas, produced further clashes with the police, as they protected the hated NF from the anti-defamation, or should I say, the anti-Nazi League and local black residents. It was the NF meeting in Southall Town Hall in 1979 and the aggressive policing of the protesters that led to the death of Blair Peach, killed by a police officer, that ensured Asians too became part of this story. The immediate trigger for the 81 Brixton riots was Operation Swamp, a 10-day operation in which 150 plainclothes officers made 1,000 stops and 150 arrests. 2 nights of rioting followed. Animosity towards the police was not confined to London. A year earlier, a poor, deprived neighbourhood of Bristol, St Paul's, witnessed a long day of riots after a police raid on a well-known community cafe. It was a black and white cafe. The 9 days of rioting in Toxteth, Liverpool, during summer 1981 were also sparked by insensitive policing of the black community, namely the arrest of Leroy Cooper. During the riots, this is in Liverpool, police, quote, police were attacked by youths with petrol bombs and paving stones, and CS gas was used for the first time on the UK mainland. A man died, knocked down by a police vehicle. 500 people were arrested, and 468 police were hurt. Deteriorating police-black relations were underpinned by the worsening socio-economic and political situation of especially black youth, a fact recognised by Scarman. During the 1970s, structural changes to the global economy were beginning to manifest in growing unemployment and a series of industrial disputes. The election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, with her authoritarian cost-cutting neoliberal agenda, worsened things considerably. The 1980s produced some of the fiercest industrial disputes in living memory: wholesale deindustrialization and mass unemployment, especially among the young. Black youth also, having to cope with a growing racism and discrimination, were especially badly hit. The response of the Metropolitan Police to Scarman was to release figures to show black people were disproportionately responsible for muggings in London. Sir Kenneth Newman, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, also introduced the idea of targeting symbolic locations, places where unemployed, often black youth congregate, although he suggested that this was an underclass problem, a prescient remark in the context of the spread of rioting in the 1990s to poor white areas. The symbolic locations were all areas of black settlement, one of which, Tottenham's Broadwater Farm, exploded in 1985 after the rough handling of a black woman, Cynthia Jarrett, in a drug raid that left her dead from a heart attack. PC Keith Blakelock, who became isolated in the mayhem, was hacked to death. The 1985 Brixton riots started similarly, with the mistaken shooting of another black woman, Cherry Gross, in another drugs raid in Handsworth, Birmingham, in the same year. 2 days of rioting followed, yet another ill-judged police arrest, and 2 Asian brothers died in the fire that engulfed their post office. Although the ancient sus laws were scrapped after a successful political campaign, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 gave police new stop and search powers on reasonable grounds. If stop and search powers were central to black communities feeling over-policed, they also felt underprotected, as escalating racial attacks tended to get dismissed by police as not real police work, as rubbish work. When Asians took to defending themselves, this led to some highly politicized trials, example Newman 7 and Newham 8, that contributed to a changing perception among police of Asian youth. More political, more troublesome. In 1989, a new Prevention of Terrorism Act with stop and search powers was introduced specifically to combat Irish terrorism. It could be used to search anyone without suspicion. Increasingly, it was used to stop and search black and Asian youth. These powers became Section 44 powers under the Terrorism Act of 2000. Thatcherism outlasted Thatcher, as did the riots. The savage cuts and industrial battles of the Thatcher years had left many more than black youth angry and resentful. This was against the police. The more overtly political poll tax riots aside, the new riots of 1991 in Cardiff, Oxford and Tyneside were, in their locally specific ways, anti-police riots, expressing exclusion and some racism in the patterns of shops and buildings targeted. Provocative police behaviour led to the spread of rioting in the Asian areas of Manning, Bradford in 1995. The police continued to connect black youth and crime. The Met Police Commissioner Paul Condon publicly stated in 1994 that the majority of muggers in London were black. The same year, police were given more, less restrictive stop and search powers, Section 60 of the new Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, that allowed them under certain circumstances to stop and search at random. Predictably, use of these powers nearly tripled between 98 and 99, 2001, 2002, with black people and Asians massively overrepresented in the figures. The under-policing of racist attacks, vividly demonstrated in the indifferent police handling of the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in 93, was born out of the resulting official inquiry. It was born out by the resulting official inquiry that found the police guilty of institutional racism. Summer 2001, like the summers of 81 and 91, saw a spate of disturbances, this time in the former Northern Mills town of Burnley, Bradford and Oldham. These started after white people attacked Asian homes. Provocative NF marches in the area led to retaliatory Asian attacks on whites. These so-called race riots led to renewed anxieties about Asian criminality. In the light of the above brief catalogue of recent riots situated in relation to the angry ongoing story of police and black relations, racism, the criminalisation of black youth, growing poverty and deprivation, chronic youth underemployment, and the spread of many of these issues to embrace poor whites and sections of Asian youth, there is a depressing inevitability about the latest angry outbursts. None of the policing issues identified by Scarman have been adequately dealt with. Rather, the police have been given more of the hated powers to stop and search, and the underlying political and socio-economic conditions of marginalised black, white and Asian youth have worsened. As Gary Young concisely and movingly put it, speaking of the latest riots, in the absence of any community leadership, viable social movements or memory of collective struggle, the most these political orphans could hope to achieve was private acquisition and social chaos. That's Young, 2011. Interesting. The numbers of these political orphans is growing. The dead end of globalization looms clearly before Europe and America's youth. Little chance of stable employment or even affordable education. If we continue to ignore the plight of our youth and fail to provide scope for them to live useful, meaningful lives, we have no right to be surprised when they wreak their revenge with meaningless, so-called, that's in inverted commas, meaningless destruction and looting. Yeah, and I thought that was interesting because this piece is by Tony Jefferson, and if you want to find out more about him, he's the Emeritus Professor of Criminology at Keele University, Keele University, K-E-E-L-E University. You can find out more about him probably if you Google that brother there. Now, family, I really wanted to start off with that as a background, and not just to point out what the obvious is, but to show that there is a history to take into account. You know, and I think it's I think it's important to bear in mind some of that history. Because, I mean, one of the last statements that was made, you know, as he said, Young put it. I thought that was just, I thought that was quite interesting, you know. So yes, family, let's try and move along slightly with this. What's going on here? Yeah, let's move along with this a little bit. And I'm going to hook you up with family. See if this live link is working here. If you want to link up with us, family, you know, if you want to make any contributions this evening, the number is 07931 276 232. Okay, that's 07931 276 232. So where are we at now? Okay, we're 20 minutes to the top of hour of 11. After myself, the hour of midnight till 3 o'clock, you got King Afro Groove in the place. So just lock in, family. It should be a really eventful evening. So let's have a look at some more stuff that we got going on here, family. Let's have a look at some more stuff. I want to make a link with Sister Janet Oda still. And I have a piece to read here, but I'm gonna hang fire on that piece for just a moment still. Let's see if we can get to something else here. Let's see if this is the piece that I was looking for. Taking its good time here. Yeah, so family. I'm going to see if I can make a link with Sister. I'm going to see if we can sort this thing out here. But just before that, I also want to read this piece out of The Voice. Give me a bit of trouble online there, so I'm going to... Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay, this was written today, I believe. And the headline is War on the Streets. This is from The Voice, written by Akila Russell, written today. It says, with gang crime a major issue among in the forthcoming mayoral elections, Akila Russell asks why youth feel the need to defend their ends. This is The Voice, family, yeah? 15th today. There are no direct answers as to why so-called postcode wars have begun to make large sections of London's no-go areas for many youths. Community activists and researchers have put forward different suggestions. Some blame the recklessness of youths. Others put it down to a desire for respect. Whatever the reason, some young people have set their horizons on doing only one thing, protecting the small patch where they live. Quote, it, meaning rivalry, is not new really. said Jennifer Blake, founder of the Safe and Sound Youth Project. Safe and Sound Youth Project. The charity, based in Peckham, South London, works to keep young people out of gangs, but also offers at-risk youth or gang members the chance to leave that lifestyle and go on to a better path. Quote, "It has been happening for a very long time, but has kind of gradually gotten worse." Blake, a reformed gang member, continued, "Young people can't get into certain areas within areas now. Like there is Letsham Estate in Peckham and Yellow Brick Estate, and they both come under SC's 15, but they both have issues with each other. To shed some light on the reasons behind the war, I spoke to two gang members, this is the voice, you know, two gang members from Hackney in East London. They made two things clear to me. The first is that stepping over the front line of others' territories can often be fatal. Secondly, their stomping grounds must be protected from potential threats. One of those potential threats can be as simple as an unfamiliar face. The reason? I was told that random attacks from rival gangs means that unfamiliar faces could often be a signal for trouble. A Hoxton gang member who called himself Jay to protect his identity told The Voice, "People are mistaken for someone else when they get caught up in some areas. When people get stopped, me or my boy might just ask them, like, where are you from? Sometimes they won't say a place that we have beef with, and we let them keep it pushing. But sometimes they are from, say, another ends that we might have dramas with, and that could be a problem." Blake pointed out there were other reasons why some young people may be keen to protect their territories. It is to do with drugs. Someone may be selling in a certain area, for example, SE15. Then someone from SE5 takes one of their punters away. So you're now taking money out of our ends. So there you go. A postcode ward, she explained. Sometimes it's as simple as walking through a neighborhood or estate, and don't ask me how and why they know a person is not from the ends, but when they get asked and they say they are not, it is automatic issues. Blake also pointed out that some killings or attacks may not be linked to gang rivalry, but to other incidents, such as a man going to a dance and then somebody looks at someone in the wrong way, and over that, there will be trouble. One of the most well-known cases that led to the murder is that of Shaquille Townsend. His 2008 killing was recreated in a BBC drama, My Murder, broadcast on March 26. Led to a cul-de-sac by teenager Samantha Joseph, a girl with whom he was smitten. Shaquille was beaten and stabbed to death by Joseph's boyfriend, Danny McLean, and a gang of other youths after unknowingly becoming part of a love triangle. This is The Voice, you know, family. Other reasons include anger about life that some young people feel. One of this year's Olympic torchbearers, Rihanna Blackett Codrington, who was nearly swept up in the gang lifestyle before deciding to change her life, said, "As a teenager, situations that I was dealing with had made me angry, not necessarily with anybody in particular, but with the world at large. It was all too easy to find like-minded individuals that then, as collectives, became gangs." Now 29, she admitted that without having her son, she would have been sucked into the gang lifestyle because of how she was feeling at the time. "The depth of the situation did not become apparent to me until I had my son. Before him, geographical areas meant more to me than my life did. He gave me a reason to live as opposed to survive." But despite cases like Blackett Codrington's, who is now a teacher under Home Office vow to commit 18 million of funding for 2011-2013 to help voluntary organisations and police tackle gun, knife, gang-related violence and prevent young people entering a cycle of crime, many young people in affected areas feel society has forgotten them. Jay said, I don't want to say though that you guys, the media, have made it out like people go around shooting strangers. That is not true at all. Like it's any better. I think that mostly people that are in this thing get killed. And when that happens, that won't be front page because nobody cares. Blake has seen this hopelessness in young people all too often. She says, they think there are no jobs. People with 1 million degrees don't get employed. Some feuds between turfs started decades ago and are only being kept alive by youngsters, or say youngers, who have no idea how the initial conflict began. Family, I'm not even going to continue reading. This is from The Voice, right? So they're trying to give us insight. But the insight that we're looking for is, what are they prepared to do to help? They give news story. Cool. They're a news agency. Cool. But the media, as the J pointed out to them, have sway. They have sway in people's opinions. So what will it take? That's what I'm asking. You know, there's a piece from the Black Agenda Report from one of the editors, yeah, speaking about black leadership, but basically leaderless. You know, like he's saying that it doesn't matter if it's the political black leadership or it's the social local black leadership, basically, or if it's the, you know, the media organizations that are connected to so-called African black communities. Somehow they just don't want to represent the true interests of people. Why can't they just come out and say what is so, rather than carrying the story that we know? Don't we know these stories? I'm saying, family, the reality is, every day we get up, you know, people live, people die, you know. So why can't we just tell straight truths? Or something that's closer to the reality? Why can't we just talk that in the paper? Is it because maybe advertising will be cut? Is it money that is more important than telling the truth? But that's the reality as well. So what is it? What's it going to take for us to surmount all these things that we see before us, that we say hinder us and stop us and impede us from carrying out our lives? Family, let me see if I'm going to just hook up something different, you know. You know, in America they're talking about, you know, in all different areas of the press, they're talking about the exact same. I'm not even going to read them out now because I don't want to take up too much more time, but they're talking about the exact same policies and procedures as are being carried out in England that, you know, bridging Mr. Jefferson, Tony Jefferson, detailed of over 30 years. You know, America has their own history as well with Africans. And their policies are the same. When they share policy, family. You know, sometimes people talk about, oh, yeah, talk about America. What, you don't appreciate that we had an American man who was literally head of the Met the other day, who was bringing in zero tolerance just the other day. You don't know that we share intelligence. I say we, you know, like I'm part of the clique, innit? Britain and America share intelligence. So if this one wants to control Africans, you know, like the so-called Willie Lynch letter where one leaves from England and goes to America to share the intelligence of how to control the niggers. Well, they haven't stopped sharing intelligence, have they? So they share intelligence on how to manage communities. Bratton, I believe the brother's name is. Zero tolerance guy, New York. Here. In England, and we nearly got him, I think, as a commissioner, when they was lining up the commissioners to see who was going to be top boy. So in America, they're talking about the same thing in terms of the latest, you know, issue in terms of the Trayvon Martin case. And I just find it interesting how we just don't want to see certain correlations and work more, I don't know, hands across the sea. Is that cliche enough? Maybe if I chat some cliche, then we, you know, people will like that. You know, we can work around the cliche. It's another thing that the editor was saying. You know, it's easier to don. You know, they've been donning on sweatshirts and wearing hoodies, you know, around the place for Trayvon Martin. And my man's saying, well, you know, that's easy, isn't it? It's easier to put on a sweatshirt and say, yeah, you know, look at this in a presidential year when people are looking for moderate votes, than it is to actually go and pressure your representative to actually do something when they've had opportunity to do so. When more, you know, justice, you know, as many serious things have come up that's related to people's liberty, and they haven't done. So I don't think we can leave it to certain sectors. I mean, you know, we also hear that, you know, you've got to be in it to win it. You know, if you want to change the system, you've got to be in the system. I think we ought to be clear enough on that that's not going to happen, family. And what are we going to change the system to? Something that's a bit more amenable, the same system of exploitation, but just something a little more amenable. What are we going to be chief nigger in charge then? Is that the system? This thing just needs to be dismantled in some type of way, at least in our minds, as a beginning to create something different. Because we cannot persist like this, family. We cannot. I'm sure we will, but I don't think it's going to be a great outcome. I want to see if I can definitely make this link here now, you know, family. Let's see if we can just try something different here.
You are the boss.
Yeah, so what type family coming up to the top of the hour again. It's quiet. 07931 if you want to come through. 276 232. I can't see what's going on here now, family. I'm sure I'll work it out very quickly. Let's get into some of this, family.
Do you know who I am?
Yes, you are the boss.
Yeah, I'm the boss.
Rise up, chat room family. So long it take me to come round to them. Rise up the Ross. Rise up Lion Man. Legs. Rashan. Bugs. Rise up the family. Listen after. Rise up all of those listeners. Near and far. London, UK, Britain and the globe. GenesisRadio.co.uk. www.genesisradio.co.uk. Having a little difficulty making a link with the sister, you know. I don't know what's going on with my phone here, so rise up, sister Janet, up there in Hull. Nah, talking business still. Rise up, sister, still. I'm gonna still try and link you there. But what I'm gonna do right now, friend, I said I had some more to read, yeah? I got quite a bit to read, you know, family. I want to read this article by Suzella Palmer. A couple of weeks ago, I played some information from John Pitts, Professor Pitts, Tim Bateman, which I might still play a piece of because it was quite interesting, and Suzella Palmer. So she's got a centerpiece in this quarterly, so she's doing very well at the moment. So rise up, Suzella Palmer, and keep doing your work, sister. You know it is. Tough, but it's meaningful. You know, it's good to have somebody who you know is, you know, ghetto people operating inside those institutions, because it's about perspectives. So I don't expect you to change the institution, but I expect you to represent our view within the institution, and I can see that you're doing that still. So rise up, Suzella Palmer. You're going to be hearing probably a lot more of her because she's getting around quite a bit now, and her position on so-called criminality within the black community is a strong position to be taken in these circles, because not hardly anybody takes up the position that she's taken up and is pushing and arguing, and quite successfully, because the evidence is there for her to be able to argue it. So let me just read a piece from Sister Suzella Palmer. It's called Dirty Babylon, Policing Black Communities and the Politics of Resistance. Some serious criminologists in there saying, I mean, I won't even go to read the advisory board, the editorial advisory board for this particular quarterly, but it is the quarterly in the country for criminologists, people who provide information, sociologists, to the government, for policy making, because the government don't know, the government don't research, ministers don't research, they get think tanks and hire commissions. Understand? This is how they do it. They don't know. So these are the people that they come to. So in terms of crime, criminality, criminal justice systems, prison systems, these are the people they come to. These are the people who their information ought to inform their activities, in a more wholesome way for people. But, as we understand what their rationale is and what they require for themselves, we shouldn't be too surprised, as my man said, like when you see the riots come, that they came, because that's the system that we need to recognize that we really live in. That's the real system that we're living in, family. Let me read this piece anyway. And this piece, it charts the history of policing the black communities. This piece here. It starts off with a quote. It's important not to lose sight of the fact that the riots were to some extent an expression of anger and resentment towards the police by some young black people. That's Morel et al. 211. As she begins, the tensions that currently exist between the police and black communities are not recent phenomena. Since the 1950s, successive generations of black people in Britain are felt underprotected as victims and over-policed as suspects. Although it can be argued that the apparent over-policing of black communities can be justified as a response to the disproportionate involvement of black males in particular forms of criminality, what cannot be ignored is that racism, whether institutional or that of individual officers, has played a central role in shaping the relationship that black people have with the police. Racist attitudes, the prevalence of deep-seated racist attitudes amongst police officers during the 70s and 80s has been well documented. For example, in a research on the role of the police, Maureen Kane found that many of the police officers involved in her study believed that most black people, whom they casually referred to as niggers, were pimps and layabouts. And she also found that it was common for black people to be treated with contempt and even brutalized by the police. Their actions were rationalized through the belief that black people were different, separate, incomprehensible, and therefore there was no good reason for not being violent if the occasion arose. That's a quote. No good reason for not being violent if the occasion arose. That's from Kane. Maureen Kane. In 1979, extensive accounts of police intimidation, harassment, brutality against black people taken from solicitors' case files, advice centers, black self-help organizations were recorded and published by the Institute of Race Relations. The document, entitled Police Against Black People, this was in 1979. Police Against Black People also provided insight into other forms of police malpractice, such as their unwillingness to protect black people against racist attacks, treating black victims as perpetrators, the medical negligence of detained suspects, the fabrication of evidence, and the use of false confessions. According to Fryer, 1984, the content of these reports exposed the ways in which criminal procedure was being used to harass black communities, and, subsequently, the antagonism between the police and the black community during this time had culminated in the inner city riots, in quotes, of the 1980s. Lord Scarman, who was commissioned to conduct an inquiry into the 1981 Brixton riots, concluded that essentially the riots were an outburst of anger and resentment by young black people against the police. This is the third time you're hearing that tonight, right? Scarman pointed to the combined effects of negative socio-economic pressures, racial prejudice, and the irrational beliefs and attitudes of both the police and the black public as contributory factors. In an attempt to reassess the role of the police, he set out a number of recommendations to improve the way in which black communities were policed, which included identifying racial prejudice among police recruits, the recruitment of more ethnic minority officers, and measures to improve community relations. Despite the recommendations put forward by Scarman and police, attempts to implement them, racism within the police continued to be a problem for black communities through the 90s. The racially motivated killing of Stephen Lawrence and the police's bungled, in quotes, handling of the investigation meant that the issue of racism within the police had again become an issue that was high on the political agenda. In a subsequent government-commissioned inquiry into the failures of the police investigating the case, McPherson, 1999, indicated that to some extent such failures were a result of institutional racism within policing. Amongst the recommendations made in the report, McPherson proposed that to increase trust and confidence in policing amongst minority ethnic communities, police should begin using performance indicators. The overall aim being the elimination of racist practices and the demonstration of fairness in all aspects of policing. He also recommended that police officers should receive ongoing training in racial awareness and the valuing of cultural diversity. However, as with the Scarman report, the recommendations proposed in the McPherson report appear to have failed adequately to address the issues of racism in the police. Thus, as Sharp and Atherton 2007 found in their research on young black people and the ethnic minority, people's experiences of policing, reports from the young people about the Thus, as Sharp and Atherton found in their research on young black and ethnic minority people's experience of policing, reports from the young people about the disproportionate extent of negative behaviour and misconduct by the police towards young people from black and other ethnic minority groups suggest that race plays a significant role in police suspect encounters. Likewise, research by the Centre for Social Justice shows the overall interaction between police and young black people were particularly problematic. My own research, which focuses on the young black males and their involvement in crime in post-war Britain, has revealed similar findings about black people's experiences of policing. Respondents who were in their youth during the 1980s and those currently under the age of 25 both talked about their own experiences of being stopped and searched in a provocative manner to get a rise out of them. Others claimed that they were racially abused and beaten up by officers. One young male who had never been in trouble with the police and by all accounts appeared to be of good character claimed he was beaten up for no reason and talked about the impact that this had on him. He quote, "I look at myself now as they see me, as a criminal. They make me feel like a criminal." The failure by police to provide documents after a stop and search implies that some stop and searches go unrecorded by the police. If unrecorded stop and searches tend to be disproportionate to particular racial groups, then the reliability of the police statistics becomes even more undermined. Also questionable is the idea that the police are working well with black communities, particularly in relation to Operation Trident. The Met Police command unit that was set up to investigate shootings amongst London's black populations. Some of the respondents in my research refer to the unit as one of the worst perpetrators of unwarranted aggression against not only black young people, but against family members of suspects and victims and witnesses of gun crime. The young people that I spoke to did not make complaints against the police as it was a waste of time. As this, in quote, it was a waste of time, and quote, nothing would be done because the police, quote, are the law. In many ways, this sentiment is responsible for what appears to be the gross underreporting of such incidents to the police or other agencies. During the 70s and 80s, a number of organisations such as the IRR and black community activists and leaders were actively engaged in monitoring and campaigning against such incidents and providing support for the victims. Since the 1990s, however, these organisations are almost non-existent. Instead, black-led organisations and community leaders appear to be far more concerned with supporting the police, who are viewed by many in Britain's black communities as illegitimate. For example, Mike Best, the former editor of the black national newspaper The Voice, of which I read an article earlier, controversially called for an increase in police stop and search practices against young black males in response to growing levels of, quote, gun crime involving young black males as both perpetrators and victims. Perspectives which appear to be less concerned with the marginalisation and criminalisation of young black males are more amenable to harsher crime control measures to deal with, quote, black youth criminality. have been expressed by other prominent black figures such as Lee Jasper, a former director of equalities and policing for the Mayor of London, and Trevor Phillips, the former head of the Commission for Racial Equality. In contrast, many within Britain's black communities hold views that are more critical of the police and instead emphasise the injustices experienced by young black males as a result of what they perceive as an institutionally racist criminal justice system that intentionally decriminalises black people. Until the issues of racism in policing and the unjust and sometimes brutal treatment of black young people by the police are taken seriously by the police, politicians, and more importantly, black community organisations and black leaders who claim to represent them, we should expect more anti-police sentiments expressed through rioting in the coming years by young people expressing their frustrations with the status quo. Thank you, Suzella Palmer. So that piece was from Suzella Palmer. Dr. Suzella Palmer is a lecturer in criminology and applied social studies at the University of Bedfordshire. You Google her, I'm sure you'll be able to get links if you're interested in any of the research. There's a lot of research that is out there that is quite interesting, family. And, you know, some people would say it's not life-changing, but it depends. You know, you arm yourself with what you need. Yeah, you have children, you arm yourself with what you need. You know? So rise up, Miss Palmer. Let me see what's going on here, family. I want to rise up the whole family, innit? Rise up 294. I'm bopping from left to right at the moment, you know, family. I'm trying to be like an octopus. Let me try to play a little piece here. As we was talking, we were just touching on that. Let me just play a piece from Professor John Pitts. This is a piece by Professor Pitts talking about, you know, because we're talking about Bedfordshire and a few institutes that do some quite serious and unique research. Yeah, and Professor Pitts leads a team that do some serious research in and around the issue, touching on issues that no other academics don't seem to want to touch around the country. They don't want to seem to acknowledge, because in acknowledging it, you have to now deal with it. But they do acknowledge it. So let me see if I can play a couple of little pieces. One by Professor John Pitts and another by Dr. Tim Bateman. And let's see if we can just play those two pieces neatly. Let me play a piece from John Pitts first.
I'm going to talk now a bit about theoretical start off with, it's important to know that within the social sciences, there's quite a lot of disagreement about what gangs are, and indeed whether they exist. So if we take, for example, the work of Simon Halsworth and Tara Young, they would say that throughout history we've seen groupings that we've described as gangs. What we're seeing now is more of the same, and that it's in the interests of the police and politicians to dress up this issue as a major problem. For example, in recent commentaries on the riots, David Cameron has said that they were orchestrated by gangs. Okay, so this is Halsworth and Young's position, and there are a number of other social scientists who agree with this. On a recent radio programme, however, we're talking about gangs, Geoffrey Pearson, the professor of sociology at Goldsmiths, who wrote Hooligans, said that the major difference between these other types of youth groupings and the violent youth gang of today is that previously these groups were, as it were, passing through. They were working class young people who in their adolescence were involved in crime, violence, but they were going to move on to join the workforce, and that would be it. Certainly if we go back to the classic study by David Downs, The Delinquent Solution, he set out in the 1960s to see if youth gangs existed in this country. He said he found no evidence of American-style gangs, but what he found were young people who in their adolescence were getting into a bit of trouble, were getting into fights and things like that, and they were then moving through to join the workforce. What Pearson says is what happens at the end of from the end of the 1990s is that these youngsters do not move on. Okay? So what we have, and that's becoming more and more evident from recent research, is we're having young people who are moving into this life, who are moving into crime, who are moving into violence, and then moving into drug dealing, but they're not moving out. And a recent study by Simon Harding, which was published in 2011, shows that the age range of gang-involved young people is getting younger at the bottom and older at the top. So it's becoming what John Hagan, the Canadian criminologist, calls embedded. We're seeing the gang becoming embedded. Now, what is a gang? Well, normally most definitions would say it is a grouping of young people that has a name or a particular designation which they and other people recognise. Its major preoccupations are crime and violence, and it's normally in conflict with the police and with other groupings. So most of the definitions of the gang would describe it thus. Now, that is different from the peer group. The peer group is normal, if you like. The peer group is which virtually everybody will have been a part of. It's a group of friends who goes through adolescence, who stick together. It's a friendship group. Sometimes they might be involved in some antisocial behaviour, sometimes they might be involved in crime, but essentially they are together because they are friends. It is a friendship group, and this is how we learn about all sorts of things. We learn about drinking, smoking, sex, but growing up, the peer group becomes very, very important to young people as they make the transition from childhood to adulthood. Now, the peer group is different from the gang, and a major difference is that it is not organised around crime, although some peer groups may become involved in crime. Neither is the gang what Gordon calls a youth movement. We look at the mods, the rockers, the Teds, the goths, etc., etc., etc. These are youth styles, very pervasive youth styles. Many people across the country will have been part of this. They like the same music, they dress in the same way, but these are not gangs. These are what Gordon calls youth movements. So the gang is a very specific entity, and indeed we can look back in recent history to a point where there were few, if any, of these gangs in existence. Certainly Stelfox, who did a survey for the police in the early 1980s, said that in England and Wales they could only find about 60 gangs, criminal gangs, and that these were composed primarily of adults. in a recent study by the Metropolitan Police, about 5 years ago, they found 178 gangs in London. Research that myself and my colleagues have done in Lambeth turned up 40 named gangs, not all of whom were particularly violent or particularly criminal, because of course anybody can call themselves anything. But within that there were some groupings which were, you know, a major cause of concern. The gas gang TM1, which is Tulse Hill Taliban, PDC, which is the poverty-driven children. And what it seems is that these groupings are proliferating. Okay. So we need to say what is a gang and what isn't a gang, but we need to be very conscious that that there are that these gangs are proliferating. In the study we undertook in Waltham Forest, which we called Reluctant Gangsters, and we wrote it up as Reluctant Gangsters, we found 17 groupings that were described by our respondents, by the people we interviewed. There were 54 people we interviewed, young people, older people, professionals, local residents. So they identified 17 of these groups. Now, at one end, there are a couple of kids who are in a children's home and their friends who got drunk, went out, started fights and mugged people. Okay. At the other end was a group linked to a family, the grandfather of whom went right the way back to the Cray Brothers organisation. This is Piff City, and they were very heavily involved in the drugs business. They were what are sometimes called middle market dealers, and they had been responsible for murders, abductions, etc., etc., etc. So what we saw was a range of groupings described as gangs. Some of whom at one end were certainly a bit of a nuisance, but at the other end were people who were very, very seriously involved in organised crime. What we did to try and distinguish between these groups was to put together a ranking system, and we borrowed this from the Metropolitan Police, and what we did was to identify that the maximum penalty for any given offence, and if we believed, using police statistics, police intelligence, information from our interviews, etc., etc., if we believe that these groupings have been responsible for these crimes, we gave it the number, we added the number together. Now, the maximum you could get, which means you've done pretty much everything, was 196. 3 of these groupings scored 196. Others scored 10 or 12. So one of the things that alerts us to is that when we're talking about gangs, we have to be very careful what we're talking about, because we're talking about a range of groupings, from relatively innocuous nuisance groups right the way through to serious organised crime, and that's something that we have to bear in mind.
So I'm saying to you, family, a whole heap of research is going on out there by various people, you know. But here's some more. Hear this piece here. This piece is by Tim Bateman, family. Tim Bateman.
Let's pursue this issue of ethnicity and gangs, ethnicity and crime. One of the most researched areas, probably in recent years, has been the overrepresentation of black and ethnic minority people within the criminal justice system. We know that they are overrepresented. The real issue is for academics and policymakers why and what can be done about it in terms of constructing policies. Tim Bateman, first of all, let's look at the evidence about BME overrepresentation, particularly amongst, say, young people, which is an area that you know well.
Well, it's true that there is an overrepresentation, but the figures, when you look at them closely, show quite different patterns according to the ethnic group to which you look. So, for example, Asian British young people are actually underrepresented in the youth justice system. The overrepresentation tends to focus around African Caribbean young people and young people of dual heritage. The second thing which is important, I think, is that for those two groups, the overrepresentation becomes more pronounced the further you get into the system. So that in terms of children coming into the youth justice system, the first level of contact, the overrepresentation is relatively small. By the time you look at the numbers who are in custody, that overrepresentation becomes very large indeed. So, for example, although black British young people make up something like 6% of the general population, in terms of those who are serving more than 2 years in prison, they represent something around 1 in 5.
So, would it be wrong to extrapolate from that they are treated more harshly in terms of sentencing? Because the evidence is not clear-cut on that, is it?
The evidence is not particularly clear-cut. I think the best evidence we have suggests that part of it is discrimination within the system. Part of it is a question of the criminal justice system amplifying discrimination outside of the criminal justice system, so that the criminal justice system by and large deals with people who come from disadvantaged socio-economic backgrounds, and that background is one that applies particularly to African Caribbean young people. So there's discrimination outside the system and within the system.
Is that in every part of the system? I mean, are more, say, BME people subject, say, to cautioning, or if they breach conditions, bail conditions, probation conditions, more likely to be sent into custody?
There is some evidence of some discrimination at each stage. So in terms of whether young people are prosecuted, black young people are more likely to be prosecuted than their white counterparts. When they get to court, reports written by youth offending teams are less likely to propose community penalties. And when they do propose community penalties, they're more likely to propose punishments rather than orders which involve rehabilitation, so curfews, community service. And then courts are more likely to impose custody, even taking into account the types of offences committed and previous convictions. So at each stage there is some discrimination.
So the big question then is that evidence of, what we've come to know and love as institutional racism, or other factors at work?
There is almost certainly it constitutes institutional racism. Whether that provides a complete account, however, is debatable, because at the same time there is evidence of different patterns of offending within different ethnic groups. So, for example, robbery, which by its very nature tends to attract more severe punishment, tends to be more prevalent among black young people. Now, part of that too could be discrimination because of charging policy. A black child may be charged with robbery where a white child might be charged with theft. But there does seem to be something different about the patterns of offending among different ethnic groups.
I mean, when you look at the figures and you analyse the figures, I mean, it's been a problematic issue down the years, hasn't it? So-called mugging, whether there are, commissioners of the Met over the years have got into very hot water for saying, yes, there are more black muggers. Now, is that just because the police arrest more people? I mean, what is the evidence for that kind of analysis?
Well, it's very, very difficult to do proper, adequate research, I think, around it. What we can say is that white young people are more likely to be nicked for burglary, and black young people more likely to be arrested for robbery, and the courts are more likely to treat robbery seriously. Now, it seems to be that some offences are more prevalent in particular areas. London has higher rates of robbery than many other urban areas, and that is partly to do with the fact that it is probably a more profitable activity than burglary in some parts of the capital because of the nature of the communities in which people live. So it's probably, the difference in patterns of offending is probably to do with the nature of the neighbourhood rather than anything to do with ethnicity itself.
And
But the research is fairly patchy.
Yeah, and I guess it could also be to do with whether a concentration of one particular ethnic minority is more likely to live near, say, tube or railway stations. Or
Those sorts of structural factors play a big part, it seems to me, yes.
Yeah. And I suppose that the overarching question is that is there an element of kind of self-fulfilling prophecy here? I mean, if the police and the prosecuting authorities believe that BME people are more likely, or youngsters are more likely to commit crime, they will commit more crime. Or the figures will show they commit
Yes,
more
I mean, I think the ideas around procedural justice, which come from some research in the States, are quite interesting. Is that the reason that people don't break the law is often to do with whether they see authority as being legitimate. And there's fairly strong empirical evidence to support that in not just within criminal justice sphere, but within other forms of authority, rule breaking, those sorts of things. And so those communities who feel that they don't have a stake in society, who feel that authority isn't legitimate in relation to, for example, the policing of their community, are probably less likely to respect that authority and may become more likely to rebel against it.
Is there evidence, I mean this may be a flyer, but is there any evidence to think that the authorities believe, the courts believe, that community penalties would work less well with BME young people than custody?
Whether they believe that or not, I'm unclear. What's certainly true is that they are used less frequently in that way. That too may be an issue of authority, because pre-sentence reports, as I've indicated already, tend to have different types of recommendations for different groups of children. That suggests to me, at least, that there is a bigger problem for supervising officers within youth offending teams who are white supervising black children. There is something of a divide there which feeds into a process whereby the engagement of those young people is perhaps harder to achieve than it is with white young people. Breach rates are higher, for example, for young people from ethnic minority backgrounds. There is some evidence from some research that we did for the Youth Justice Board too, that minority ethnic young people are more likely to be asked just to come to the door and sign in rather than engage in a offending work or that kind of thing.
Just a final question, and I don't know whether there is any evidence to support this view or not, that when there is a particular, say, punitive period in terms of, say, drug-related crime, when governments and ministers are emphasising penalties as against other ways of treating it, does that impact more harshly on BME offenders?
Probably. Certainly the street crime initiative under the Blair administration led to a big increase in arrests for offences such as robbery. It led to a reduction in arrests for offences such as burglary, motor vehicle offending and those sorts of things. Now, if it's right that certain ethnic groups may be more involved in offences that occur on the street, then it will inevitably have a differential effect on that community.
Yes, family. I thought that was quite interesting. I've got one more piece to read out of the Criminal Justice Matters, but before that, I want to touch out of this next piece. Yeah, and this is from the Birmingham Mail, the 12th of this month. That would have been Thursday. And the headline is, Body of Birmingham Dad Kingsley Burrell not released 1 year on. I'm going to read this story, family, and I'm going to read another story at the back of it. You know, just to indicate some of the things that that we have going on. Angry relatives of Kingsley Burrell, who mysteriously died after being detained by police a year ago, are still Sorry. Angry relatives of Kingsley Burrell, who mysteriously died after being detained by police a year ago, are still waiting for his body to be released for his funeral. Kingsley Burrell, 29, dialed 999 after being threatened by a group of men while with his young son in Icknield Port Road, Birmingham, on March 27th last year. But when officers turned up, they detained the trainee security guard under the Mental Health Act, you know, roadside sections, despite his family saying he had no history of mental illness. Within hours, Mr. Burrell was sectioned and taken to a mental unit in the city, where his family claimed he had mysterious physical injuries and was not allowed to speak to them. 3 days later, police were called to the Mary Seacole, ironic isn't it, Mental Institute in Winston Green after an incident, inverted commas, involving the dad of two, and he was transferred to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital where he died on March 31st. The IPCC, that criminal unit of their own, the IPCC immediately launched an inquiry and has now asked Dorset police to begin a further investigation into the death. Last night, Mr. Burrell's sister, Kadisha Brown Burrell, said the family still had no idea how he had died and could still be months away from having a funeral. She said, "How can they keep a body for a year? It's been more than a year now and they are dragging their heels. We are still grieving and need closure, but have been told by the Dorset police investigations will take at least another 6 months. We're angry and frustrated and don't know what is happening. It's been painstakingly difficult, frustrating and emotionally overwhelming for the family to begin to come to terms with his death, especially not being able to lay his body to rest, not knowing the sequence of events that led up to his death and how he died." Mr. Burrell was dad to 5-year-old son Caden, who was with him when he was detained by police, and 10-year-old daughter Shravita. Student Miss Brown Burrell regularly visits her brother's body, which is being held at the mortuary at Sandwell Hospital. She added, "I personally don't have much confidence in the IPCC investigation. And we have not, I repeat, and we have not been kept informed. The family has now attended 8 or 9 pre-inquest hearings, yet still nobody can tell us what or who killed Kingsley. It's not fair on his children, especially his little boy, who can't stop thinking and talking about what happened that day." A spokesman for the IPCC said investigators have interviewed 4 West Midlands police officers under criminal caution and a further 10 officers as witnesses. He added, "In total, more than 100 witness statements have been obtained from police officers, medical professionals, ambulance staff and members of the public. Footage from CCTV cameras at 4 locations has been recovered and reviewed, and hundreds of documents have been seized." That's a nice word to use, police on police. "Seized as part of the independent investigation. Earlier this year, after liaison with the HM Inspectorate of Constabulary, Dorset Police were requested by the IPCC to begin an investigation into the actions of non-police personnel who had contact with Mr. Burrell, and they continue to undertake inquiries. The IPCC has provided regular updates at HM Coroner's pre-inquest hearings and to the family and interested parties." That's what the IPCC are saying. Yet Kadisha Brown Burrell is saying that they have not been kept informed. She doesn't have, I personally don't have much confidence in the IPCC investigation, and we have not been kept informed. I mean, over the last few years, that's all I've been hearing. These apologists for police who never bring police to book. What is the point of having them? They might as well just bring back the Police Complaints Authority and just call it what it is. You know, like the League of Nations, they call it the United Nations, but it's still the same set of people, still the same crew. They might as well just have called it what it is. Can you imagine that? The son still asking, 5 years old, a year on, they don't even know how, who, when, what, or where their loved one died, just died. And they won't release his body. Seems to me that they're looking for a good enough excuse to be able to tell people when they finally do release the body, you know, what and what and what and what. Let me just back that up straight away with this. This is out of The Voice. And this is on the 15th. This is also today. Yeah, Trudy Simpson, Juliana Lucas and David Wood from The Voice. The headline is Call for Closer Monitoring of Police. Community leaders want Met watchdogs brought back. Aren't the Met watchdogs the IPCC? In fact, all police watchdogs, are they supposed to represent them? Racist officers can only be rooted out if they fear being found out by silent shoppers, spot checks, recording devices in police vans, and the reintroduction of independent monitoring groups. Leading black figures have said in the wake of a race controversy that has shaken the Met Police. Should be interesting. They told The Voice that practical solutions are urgently needed for the capital's police to help crack down on racism within the ranks and win back public trust, following a wave of scandals that have hit London's police force in the past few weeks. Now, let me just go back, family, just slightly. Let me just go slightly and just read that again. Remember, we're talking about black leaders and, you know, the history of black leadership, the so-called black leadership within Britain. And I might, if I have time, just read the piece out of the Black Agenda report, you know, of the parallel in America. But let me just read that again. Racist officers can only be rooted out if they fear being found out by silent shoppers, spot checks, recording devices in police vans, and the reintroduction of independent monitoring groups, leading black figures have said in the wake of a race controversy that has shaken up the Met Police. Now, it's interesting because I'm struggling to see who these leading black figures are. But hopefully, you know, when I get further down, I'll find out. So let's have a look. They told The Voice that practical solutions are urgently needed for the capital's police to help crack down on racism within the ranks and win back, you know. Remember, I just detailed the experience of African people at the hands of the police by two academics, because they do the research, over the last 30 to 40 years. Yeah. And it didn't mention anything like they had the people's trust in the first place. No, I don't remember actually seeing that. But The Voice and these leading black figures are named. Says that the police need urgent practical solutions to help them crack down on racism within the ranks and win back public trust, following a wave of scandals that have hit London's police force in the past few weeks. Incidents in the last fortnight include officers caught on a mobile phone calling a 21-year-old black man, Mauro Demetrio, a nigger. Accusations from the family of a black bus driver, Kester David, that his death was not properly investigated by police officers because of his race. These are scandals that have come to light within the last fortnight, yeah? Officers caught on a mobile calling a 21-year-old black man, Mauro Demetrio, a nigger. Accusations from the family of a black bus driver, Kester David, that his death was not properly investigated by officers because of his race. Reports that the Met Police has suspended 8 officers and a civilian in 10 separate allegations of racist abuse, bullying and violence that reportedly targeted a staff member. Black police and community support officers being bullied and abused by officers and staff over an 18-month period at Wandsworth Police Station. The Met has suspended 8 officers and a civilian in part as part of a case referred to by the watchdog, the IPCC. 10 separate allegations of racist abuse, bullying, violence, and so on and so forth. 8 out of 10 officers originally referred to the IPC were suspended. So out of those 10 officers that they were talking about, 8 of them were actually suspended for that racist abuse, bullying, and so on and so forth. Violence. Sorry, I forgot the violence. They were suspended. Which I don't know which of these black leaders or black figures says, I think the kind of silent shopper process is something that we used before, and it did keep people on their toes. Sorry, family, I just find it really ironic. You know, why do you want to keep people on their toes? Why should they be kept on their toes? Because, see, the premise is, and I'm not even going to get into one, but the premise is that we should be ruled over by these people. Regardless of the fact, that in life, everyday life, I can see every day that they're quite a demonic people, these rulers of the world, these rulers of this particular system. White, black, grey, all of them who commit to this particular system and say it's great. They're quite ruthless, vicious people. And they forgive each other quite easily for their viciousness. And we seem to just feel that the premise is that we should just let them rule over us. You know, get into the system to change the system. Not to eradicate the system, but just to change it. Because, in the back of our minds, it's like, we need to be ruled by somebody. Why not them? Family, we need to think about this clearly. Their system is collapsing. We don't want to see it, don't see it. They would like to superimpose another system right over the top of this collapsing one. Whether it's been intentionally collapsed or not. Yeah, it's collapsing. And yet still we feel that we should be ruled over by these people. White, black, and all in between. All have that mindset of this particular predatory capitalist system that doesn't care about women, children, nobody. It's quite moderate now. We still have freedom to walk around in certain places. But that can change, family. 8 out of the 10 officers originally referred to the IPCC were suspended. I think the kind of silent shopper process is something that we used before, and it did keep people on their toes, especially after Stephen, said one of the Met's top black officers, Superintendent Leroy Logan, who is now in charge of security for the London Olympics. Interesting, isn't it? Leroy. Officers know they could be speaking to someone who is assessing their performance, and the word will get out. Logan was backed by former Detective Chief Inspector Dr. David Michael, who told The Voice they, the Metropolitan Police, should be using subterfuge, using mystery shopping activities, spot checks, etc. If they are serious, we need to go the whole way with technology. With what's transpired now, I think every operational police vehicle should have a video camera. We need to have at least audio recording inside any police vehicle that's going to transport an arrested person, so that all conversations are recorded. Some campaigners also said there should be reviews of how police carry out their duties on the beat, how they deal with the complaints against officers, and also how agencies such as the IPCC and the Crown Prosecution Service investigate and handle complaints. Veteran anti-racism campaigner Lee Jasper said, if you're involved in suspicious black deaths in custody, you should be immediately suspended from duty and be forced to give an immediate statement. At the moment, neither of those things happen, which gives the green light for a culture of racial profiling and disproportionate use of violence against black men. Logan added, it was a mistake for the government to disband independent monitoring groups such as the Stephen Lawrence Steering Group, which he said was very critical in holding chief constables to account, and I truly believe that needs to be brought back. We are trying to get a meeting with Nick Herbert, the Justice Minister, and or Home Secretary Theresa May through our National Black Police Association office. Bevan Powell, chair of the Metropolitan Black Police Association, agreed, but he said there needs to be political intervention. This is great. This is great. What these guys are saying. Racism is not just about the Met Police, and it's something that is going to affect forces across the country. So for that reason, we believe the Lawrence Steering Group that was set up by the Home Secretary should be reconvened, or something similar, where these issues can be looked at. I want to rise up all the young soldiers them out there, you know. Yeah. Racism is not just about Met Police. It's and it's something that's going to affect forces across the country. So for that reason, we believe the Lawrence Steering Group that was set up by the Home Secretary should be reconvened, or something similar, where these issues can be looked at. Yeah, I want to rise up Leon. Yeah, Leon had a Black Police Association secretary in here a few years ago. You know, I say in here, we went to interview him. And he thoroughly grilled him and allowed me to grill him as well a little after that. You know, these people, I'm saying, great. Go and do your thing. Make it known to the government. Protest, campaign, great. But how about you come back to the so-called community you're saying you're protesting on behalf of? That's what Susanna Palmer was talking about. That's what Dr. Palmer was talking about. All these voices, and please, I've got about 5-6 minutes, family. Yeah, I'm just going to get through this. I'm going to get through a text that I definitely wanted to read out of a few. I'm sorry, family, I'm not going to read them all. Time. I'm going to get through this, get through them texts. And if Afro Groove is not here at the allotted time, I'm going to get through one or two other bits and pieces, because I've got plenty of stuff here, family, that I wanted to get through. There's a whole heap of stuff that's been going on, all related, and most definitely related to us as a group, if we consider ourselves such. So if possible, after the midnight hour, you might get a little more. This is Bevan Powell, who's the chair of the Metropolitan Black Police Association. He said any steering group should be headed by the Home Secretary. This is Theresa May, and have representatives from all areas. It has to have a senior representative from all of the forces across the country, as well as having a community lead and justice lead, because this has an impact on the criminal justice prison probation office as well. However, Peter Herbert, family, I'm calling out all these black figures, These are the black figures they're calling on. The usual players, blood. However, Peter Herbert, head of the Society of Black Lawyers, advocated having more independent monitoring groups. He told The Voice there has been a lack of independent scrutiny of police behaviour following the disbandment of monitoring groups. Herbert said, for example, the Met Police Authority had a hate crime forum, which I chaired. That's disappeared, and the powers were devolved to a number of parts of the Metropolitan Police, and therefore it tackled scrutiny. One of the things I think would have not happened if the forum had been around is the CPS decision initially deciding not to pursue charges against officers for calling Dimitri a nigger. Last week, Met Police Commissioner Craig Mackey, should I say, said in a statement, quote, the Commissioner made it clear after the first alleged incident came to light last week that we take the issue of racism extremely seriously. I want to reiterate, there is no room for racism in the Met. So family, we're coming rapidly to the top of the hour, And let me see if I can reach into the chat room and talk to me people and one more time. Yeah, differently. What's going on here? Yeah, differently. Rise up, Ras. Rise up the whole of the family still, you know. You know, it's been a mad day in the studio for me, family. So I'm glad you just bear with me. You understand? Rise up the Ras, the lion me, and the legs. The legs, you know. Sorry, legs. Legs, man. So more masculine. Sorry. The legs sound like something like a sheer thing. Sorry, family. Legs, Russian, Bugs, Indigo, and Jay. Rise up, Jay. Rise up, family. Yeah, I don't want to definitely rise up all the people them were locked in still. 294. Yeah, rise up 294. 294 says, Grimz, I hear you loud and clear. Would call in, but I don't know what to say. What can I say? I'm a 38-year-old mother of 2, and I don't know how peeps are just putting up with all the same shit day in, day out. A revolution is needed right now, but everyone or most are just happy to put them head into the sun. How much more do we need before we do something? I don't know. Maybe Shankles and Bullwipe might do it. Then it'll be late for us. 21st century chattel slavery. Are we ready for that? I'd risk my life for a cause so my children can have a better tomorrow, or just a tomorrow. Because this system has to go ASAP. Rise up 294. And you know what, sis? I'm feeling your sentiments, you know. Most definitely. I'm feeling your sentiments. You know. So yeah, family, that is being us for now so far. I just rise up Sister Janet. I don't know how I couldn't get a link for you, you know, sister. I don't know. Couldn't get no signal on nothing at all in there to you. Yeah, but I want to rise up all the families still, you know. So, I'm possibly here next week, family. I'm possibly not. There was some information that I definitely wanted to touch on, but I'm not sure that I'm going to get to touch on it at this present moment still. So, I would say, hang tight, family. That's... We're heading out of the place, innit? All right, apart from Facebook family, you know it go. Rise up all over the family, London, UK, Britain, and the globe. This is G.C.U.P.